China's debt-ridden property sector has been at the center of the country's economic problems. But this week, property shares have surged. The boost comes after Chinese authorities put pressure on state banks to speed up lending to developers. Authorities began drafting a list of 50 real estate firms that would be eligible for a range of financing. It's the most forceful push yet to end the country's property crisis.
Shares of heavily indebted developer Country Garden jumped more than 20% on the Shanghai Stock Exchange, as media reports say the company is on a list of real estate firms eligible for increased financial assistance by the government. And the Chinese government called on banks to increase loans to the struggling construction sector, which constitutes a quarter of Chinese GDP. Over the past 2 decades, real estate developers like Evergrande had enjoyed rapid growth, creating millions of jobs, fueled by the expectation that the building frenzy would persist. They took on substantial debts to finance more and more projects that have now transformed into ghost towns, which threaten to shake the belief not only in the Chinese dream, but also the Communist Party. The government fears that the troubles of the property market will spill over to the financial sector, a fear coming true. On Thursday, financial conglomerate Zheng Zhi Enterprise Group told investors it is insolvent with liabilities of up to $64 billion due to its heavy exposure to the Chinese real estate sector.
Joining me now is George Magnus. He's an economist and a research associate at Oxford University's China Center. Thanks for coming on. George, China's property market is a big part of its economic slump story. This push for financial support, is that going to help, or is that merely a drop in the bucket?
Well, I think it should help to stabilize things. I mean, having said that, we thought when measures were being announced in the last 2 or 3 months, and liquidity was being made available and banks were being directed to lend to property developers. I mean, we thought that by now the market would perhaps have bottomed out. But it keeps on kind of displaying this kind of pattern where you get these kind of brief increases, maybe in transactions volumes and so on, and then it all goes flat again. So, yeah, I mean, this is just going to be the latest effort to try to stop the market and sales and construction and investment volumes from continuing to decline. And we'll just have to see if that happens. There's not much demand out there, which is the problem.
Right. Speaking of efforts in the pipeline, China's new finance minister announced this month that Beijing will also boost budget spending. Can expansionary fiscal policy really solve the problem here?
Well, I think yeah. I mean, the short answer to that is I think it could, right? I mean, so they've announced a program of about 1 trillion yuan, which is about 0.7, 0.8% of GDP. Authorized by the central government. So this is going to be more investment in infrastructure, social facilities, possibly lending to the real estate sector as well, which will, it'll help a bit, but it's really not the kind of, it's the wrong kind of, fiscal stimulus, really. The fiscal stimulus that China really needs quite a lot of is the kind of stimulus that's going to spur household consumption. And that's something which the government has a kind of a political blockage about. They don't really want to do that on a scale that would matter.
Where's that blockage coming from?
Well, the problem is that what we have in China, it's not just, I mean, obviously it's a government that has a lot of control and authority. And in a way, you'd think that a government that was like that would be able to do whatever it wants. The trouble is, that control is only good enough if it's actually being used properly. And I think the Leninist nature of the party and its objections to consumerism and welfarism as we would understand it, they run quite deep. Now, I'm not saying it would never change, but certainly under Xi Jinping, it seems very unlikely that they will do this voluntarily.
Right. Now, a growing number of commentators are saying that China's rise as an economic superpower is reversing in light of what we just addressed. Do you agree?
Well, I think that the sort of the fashionable bit about that, which is peak China, it's all going pear-shaped. I mean, this is a little bit there's a little bit of hype behind that, really, which I think is partially correct. But I think you have to kind of contextualize it, really. I mean, the model that China operates, the economic model that it works with, has been really faltering for about 10 or 11 years, really. So COVID obviously made it a bit worse, of course, as it did everywhere. But Xi Jinping hasn't really helped because he hasn't really addressed the problems. And actually, in some ways, he's become a bit of an obstruction to reform and to solutions. So my own view is really that, China has this kind of window of catch up, which is almost closed. I'm not saying that China won't continue to develop, and that Chinese companies, many of which are now household names around the world, won't continue to succeed. But two things can be true. You can have that, and you can also have an economy that's actually replete with deep economic problems, asset bubbles, imbalances, and so on. And these are the things that China really has to get on top of in the years to come.
Right. For our viewers who might not be as familiar with China's economic model that's faltering, according to you, what are the top two issues, briefly?
Right. So basically, this is a very typical Asian kind of economic model, which is predicated on extremely high rates of investment and savings. The trouble is that there comes a point where you need to change that model and change the institutions that support it. So like the Koreans and the Taiwanese and the Singaporeans have done, and Japanese in years gone by. But this is the point at which China really ought to be doing these kinds of political changes. But it's not something which the present government is really very keen to do.
Right. And Chinese officials are due to hold their annual economic policy meeting this December to flesh out their objectives for the year to come. What do you think will be the focal points?
Well, the so-called Central Economic Work Conference, as you refer to it, it'll probably urge, the rumors that I'm hearing are that it will urge the government to, pursue a growth target for 2024 of somewhere between 5.5%, maybe even 5 to 6%. But this is part of the, part of the problem, actually, is that when you set a growth target like that, you end up having to chase it all the time and to do things, particularly with lending and investment in infrastructure and real estate, which actually are uncommercial. They don't really work in the way that you should want them to work. It would be much better if they dropped the growth target and just tried to do liberal reform. But that's really very Pollyanna, I'm afraid. That's not really going to happen. But there will be, certainly urging to stabilize the real estate sector, stabilize the financial sector, increase economic growth. These things will be par for the course, I think.
George Magnus, thank you so much for speaking to us today.